Guys, Paul here, and today we're finishing off our series on Before I Go. And as we do, I want to kick us off with a question. How many times this week have you used the phrase, "that's not fair"? Teachers treating people differently, the ref of the match, your brother or sister getting something they wanted and you never. Life just doesn't seem fair sometimes, does it? When we see things happen that is unfair, it can bring up a bunch of different feelings and emotions for different people. Like maybe it's sadness or disappointment, anger, insecurity, frustration. I still remember the first time I was grounded, and it was just so unfair. I was still in primary school and I was having dinner at a friend's house, but my mum had a rule that I was not allowed to cross a certain road, the main road, on my own. And all my friends could and I just couldn't. So when I was in primary school, Pokemon cards had just come out and the shops were sold out so quick, and probably a bit like Prime today. Me and my friend knew of a shop that had some, but it was across that main road, and he was allowed to cross it, but I wasn't, and it was so unfair. So do you know what? We went. We got the Pokemon cards, and I ended up being grounded. And his mum said we were allowed, but maybe I should have known the rules or something. But have you ever been there? The truth is, we know that life doesn't always end up the way we think it's supposed to be. We see unfair things happen all the time. We see the one kid finally stand up to a bully in class only to be getting in trouble because he was being disruptive. All the while, everyone knows that the bully was instigated to think. Or we see the lad who sleeps through class get the best marks while the person who studied for hours barely passes. We read or we hear about unfair things happening to people around the world. And when something feels unfair, it can bring up a lot of emotions in a person, which is totally understandable. We want things to be made right. Where's this justice in all of this? And with that in mind, today we're going to look at a time when Jesus did the exact opposite. He did something that most people would consider unfair. For the last few weeks, we've been talking about the things Jesus said and did before he was crucified. But this week, we're going to talk about something Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, did to Jesus before the crucifixion. And Jesus had different types of relationships and friendships with all the disciples. And this makes sense because we do the same thing. Friends who we hang out with in school, friends who we hang out with in church, those friends who we would share everything with, and others we would just tell what we had for dinner last night. One of Jesus' friends, Peter, was the friend you're nervous to go out with because you might just say something offensive to somebody, and before you know it, you're in a fight. That was Peter. He was the type of friend who always seemed to say or do something without fully thinking it through. And some of you may have a friend a bit like that, and some of you might be that friend. And in this particular situation, Jesus was finishing up dinner with his disciples after sharing some difficult news with them. He just shared that one of the disciples around the dinner table was going to betray him. Now, we know that betrayal of one person was Judas would lead to Jesus' death. And even today, thousands of years later, we name Judas is connected with betrayal. But Jesus knew that technically all his friends were about to abandon him. And he told them that. And of course, Peter is the one who responds and speaks up without even thinking it through. Check it out. Peter declared, "Even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you." And Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth, Peter. This very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times, and that you even know me." No, Peter insisted, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. Now, at this point in their lives, the disciples had been learning from Jesus' teaching for years. Everything Jesus had ever said would happen had happened. But our friend Peter was convinced that he would never deny Jesus. There's no way he would betray his teacher. But just a few hours later, while Jesus was going through a frightening trial that would lead to his death, Peter was approached by some townspeople who asked if he was one of Jesus' disciples. And 3 times, one right after the other, Peter denied that he even knew Jesus, his friend and his teacher. And what would you do if your best friend acted like that? They didn't even know you on the most difficult night of your life. Would you want to get them back for what they did? Drop them in as your friend forever? Or betray them in return? Like, after all, that would be only fair thing to do, right? Well, here's what Jesus did. After being resurrected, Jesus decided to surprise the disciples at a beachside breakfast. And here's what happened. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "Well, you know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." Jesus was showing Peter that their relationship could be restored. Plus, he was encouraging Peter to lead and care for other people who would follow him in the days ahead. Jesus made sure to restore their friendship back to the same solid place it was before the denial. If it were me, I'm not sure I'd want to acknowledge Peter. If I did, I'd probably want to have a go at him. Probably he left when Jesus was in his most vulnerable place, but after abandoning him and totally betraying him, Jesus re-established the relationship. Like, how totally, absolutely and completely unfair. Like, Jesus' response was 100% unfair in the best way possible. Technically, what Jesus did by befriending Peter again wasn't fair. But the word unfair is got this really negative meaning. So another word to describe how Jesus treated Peter is grace. Like, grace is being unfairly good to someone who doesn't deserve it. That was the situation between Jesus and Peter. Jesus was unfairly good to Peter on the beach after his resurrection. And it was an example of how God treats us as well. God's grace is unfairly good. Even though we're not perfect and we mess up daily, God is always willing to extend grace for the sake of the relationship we have with God. And I mentioned it earlier how unfair situations can bring up many different feelings. And when a person is treated unfairly in a negative way, it can create feelings of anger and frustration, hopelessness, fear and low self-esteem. Grace can stir up different feelings as well. The different thing about grace is how easy it is. It's a gift that's given when you don't deserve it. Think of it like this. Imagine I gave you a tenner. You'd be feeling pretty good and you'd think that it was just a kind gesture. And you'd go about and get yourself a Mackey's or something. Well, what if the day before I gave you the tenner, you'd really hurt my feelings? You'd been rude and said some things that were really horrible. Well, what if I said and sent you a tenner the next day, no strings attached, and just asked for a chat? Some of you may be thinking, that's ludicrous. Like, why would you even do that? You don't even get anything out of it. And that would all be true. You're starting to kind of get this idea. It makes you feel uncomfortable, ashamed and embarrassed. And at this point, you'll probably prefer me to go and be mad at you because it's unfair in a good way, and that's grace. See, God is ready and willing to treat us like God treated Peter. When you mess up, God always is willing to forgive you and show you grace. And that's just who God is. The question is, are you ready to receive it? In fact, that's the first thing I want you to do in response to God's grace. The first is accept it. Grace is a gift we don't deserve, an unfairly good gift. Don't reject the gift out of pride or as a way to punish yourself. Accept the opportunity to have a good relationship with God. Some of you, it might feel difficult to accept it, but I promise it's actually easy. Just accept God's grace and forgiveness. And for some of you, it might feel like a huge relief. And that's a normal feeling too. Accept God's grace and forgiveness. It's meant for you. And when it comes to grace being unfair, it's okay because God's grace is unfairly good. And here's the next thing. Share it. We don't keep good news to ourselves, and God's grace is good news for everyone. When Jesus says, feed my sheep to Peter, this isn't literally feeding his sheep, but Jesus is asking Peter to look after his followers, take care of them and continue to show them what I would be like in that situation. And that's the same thing we've been encouraged to do too. Like, imagine what would change in the way you would think of and see God based on God's unfairly good grace. Imagine how different your life would look and our world would look if we were to be more intentional about receiving and giving grace. Being unfairly good to someone who doesn't deserve it.